I drove 45 minutes across Atlanta to give my 2-year-old grandson a wooden train I carved with my own 2 hands. Instead of a warm welcome, my daughter-in-law cracked the door open and handed me a laminated list of rules. She looked me dead in the eye and said if I wanted weekend access to my own blood, I needed to pay a $500 monthly subscription fee to support his influencer brand. I did not yell. I did not argue. I just left the toy on the porch and walked away. 3 weeks later, I handed my son an envelope that completely demolished their fake luxury lifestyle. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a lesson they will never forget. My name is Wallace Coleman. I am 71 years old and my hands tell the story of a man who built his life from the dirt up. I spent 45 years running a commercial plumbing empire in Atlanta. I started with a single rusty wrench and a beat-up van in the 1970s facing down doors that were slammed in my face just because of the color of my skin. By the time I retired, my company was laying the pipes for half the skyscrapers downtown. But to my daughter-in-law, Chloe, I was just an old black man who used to fix toilets and now scraped by on a fixed pension. I never corrected her. I learned a long time ago that invisible wealth gives you the ultimate power. It was a bright Saturday morning when I pulled my old reliable pickup truck into the driveway of my son Julian's upscale suburban mansion. The neighborhood was the kind where the grass looked too green to be real and every driveway had a leased luxury car. I was there to see my grandson Leo for his 2nd birthday. I brought a gift. It was not a plastic piece of garbage from a big box store. It was a wooden train set I had spent 3 weeks carving and sanding in my garage. My late wife Loretta always loved handmade gifts. She used to say they carried a piece of your soul. I walked up the perfectly paved walkway holding the small wooden train wrapped in simple brown paper. I rang the doorbell. I could hear the faint sound of a dog barking inside, then footsteps. The door opened, but only about a quarter of the way. Chloe stood there blocking the entrance. She was dressed in some beige matching lounge set that probably cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled for whatever social media video she was filming that day. She held her expensive smartphone in one hand, her thumb hovering over the screen as if my presence was an irritating interruption to her very important online life. "Hello, Chloe. I brought this for Leo," I said, my voice calm and steady, holding out the wrapped train. She looked at the package, her nose scrunching up slightly as if I had handed her a bag of trash. "Wallace," she sighed, not even bothering to call me Dad or Mr. Coleman. "We talked about this. Well, Julian was supposed to talk to you about this." She did not reach for the gift. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her beige cardigan and pulled out a crisp, laminated piece of paper. She shoved it toward my chest. I instinctively took it. I looked down. Printed in a modern, elegant font were the words, "Grandparent Rules." I read the first few lines. "Fridays only. 1 hour maximum. No unapproved gifts. No sugar. No photos without written permission." I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. "What is this?" "Chloe, it is a boundary list, Wallace," she said, her voice dripping with that fake condescending sweetness people use when they think they are talking to someone stupid. "Julian and I have decided that Leo needs a very structured environment. He is building an online presence. Our followers expect a certain aesthetic. Wooden handmade toys just do not fit his brand. He is a 2-year-old boy, not a corporation." But I kept my mouth shut. I let her keep talking because arrogant people always dig their own graves if you give them a shovel. "And there is one more thing," she continued, shifting her weight and crossing her arms. "We are implementing a childcare contribution system for the grandparents. Since my parents bought him a $1,000 imported stroller last week, they get unlimited weekend visits. If you want weekend access, we are asking for a $500 monthly contribution. I know you are on a fixed pension from your plumbing days, so maybe you can pick up some odd jobs to cover it." I stood there on the pristine porch, the laminated paper feeling heavy in my calloused hand. A childcare contribution. My daughter-in-law was charging me a subscription fee to see my own flesh and blood. She was putting a price tag on a grandfather's love, measuring my worth against her wealthy white parents who bought their way into her perfect social media life. I looked past her shoulder. Deep in the foyer, I saw Julian, my son, the boy I had worked 18-hour days to send to private schools and a top-tier university so he would never have to touch a dirty pipe in his life. He was standing near the staircase wearing a designer sweater, staring down at his expensive shoes. He did not look up. He did not step forward to defend me. He just stood there, a spineless ghost in his own house, letting his wife extort his father. 45 years of sacrifice, and this was the man I had raised. "Wallace, did you hear me?" Chloe snapped, waving her manicured fingers slightly to get my attention. $500 a month, or you can stick to the 1 hour on Fridays. It is your choice. I looked at the laminated paper again. I looked at the beautifully carved wooden train in my other hand. I thought about the sweat, the sawdust, and the love I had poured into it. Then I looked at Chloe's smug, entitled face and Julian's cowardly posture in the background. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse. I did not defend my financial status or tell her that I could buy her entire neighborhood in cash if I wanted to. You do not argue with a mosquito, you just wait for it to land. I understand, I said quietly. I bent down slowly, my joints aching just a bit from the cold morning air, and placed the wrapped wooden train gently on the welcome mat. I stood back up, holding the laminated list of rules. Have a good weekend, Chloe. I turned my back on her and walked down the driveway. I heard the heavy oak door click shut behind me. I climbed into my old truck, put the key in the ignition, and looked at the laminated paper sitting on my passenger seat. My silence was not a surrender. It was the calm before a devastating storm. They thought they had backed a poor, helpless old man into a corner. They did not realize they had just handed the executioner a list of their demands. I drove back to my modest townhouse in the city in absolute silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone to vent my frustrations. In my 71 years on this earth, I have learned that anger is a useless emotion if it is not channeled into action. Anger makes you sloppy. It makes you raise your voice when you should be sharpening your tools. And that laminated piece of paper sitting on the passenger seat of my truck was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war. When I walked through my front door, the house felt incredibly empty. My late wife Loretta used to fill these walls with music and the smell of fresh baking. She would have been heartbroken to see what Julian had become. She had always spoiled him just a bit, hoping to give him the soft life we never had. We grew up drinking from segregated water fountains and scraping by on leftover rations. We wanted our son to wear tailored suits and sit in air-conditioned boardrooms. We gave him the world, and in return, he let his entitled wife charge me $500 a month to see my own grandson. I sat down in my leather armchair and picked up my phone. I did not call Julian to argue. I did not call Chloe to beg. I called the one man I trusted more than anyone else when it came to business. His name was Vernon. Vernon and I had been doing business together since 1982. He was a brilliant forensic accountant who knew where every single penny of my commercial plumbing empire was buried. He was also the man who helped me set up the blind trust that funded Julian's highly publicized tech startup 3 years ago. Julian never knew I was his main investor. When he came to me asking for $2 million to launch his software company, I knew his pride would never let him accept a direct handout from his blue-collar father. Chloe would have sneered at plumbing money. So I had Vernon create a shell corporation. We became the anonymous angel investors. Julian thought he had won over a group of elite venture capitalists. He thought he was a self-made genius. Vernon answered on the second ring. I told him I needed a complete top-to-bottom audit of Julian's company, and I needed it immediately. Vernon did not ask questions. He knew by the tone of my voice that something was fundamentally wrong. I wanted bank statements, expense reports, payroll records, and tax filings. I wanted to see exactly how my son was running the business I secretly financed. By Tuesday afternoon, Vernon was sitting across from me at my dining room table. He looked grim. He pulled a thick stack of financial reports from his leather briefcase and spread them out in front of me. I put on my reading glasses and began to review the documents. What I saw made my blood run cold. Chloe spent all her time bragging on social media about her brilliant tech CEO husband. She posted photos of him in expensive tailored suits drinking imported champagne on private jets. She painted a picture of a billionaire in the making. But the numbers on Vernon's reports told a completely different story. The startup was not a booming success. It was a sinking ship. Julian was bleeding money. The software development had stalled months ago because he kept pulling capital out of the company to fund their luxurious lifestyle. I traced the outgoing wire transfers. Tens of thousands of dollars were being funneled into personal accounts. The mortgage on their suburban mansion was being paid directly from the company payroll account. The lease for Chloe's luxury vehicle was registered as a corporate expense. I even found charges for designer handbags, exotic spa retreats, and expensive dinners at places I could not even pronounce. They were treating the business like a personal piggy bank. but the worst part was not the embezzlement, it was the desperation. The reports showed that Julian had recently taken out 2 massive high-interest loans against the company assets just to keep the lights on. He was borrowing from predatory lenders at ruinous interest rates. He was leveraging the equity that my blind trust actually owned. My son was not a genius CEO. He was a fraud drowning in debt wearing a designer suit to hide his panic. He was mortgaging his future to pay for his wife's social media facade. I sat back in my chair and took off my glasses. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling a profound sense of disappointment wash over me. I had spent 45 years laying pipes in the freezing cold and the blazing heat. I built my fortune through sweat and blistered hands and relentless integrity. If a client paid me to install a boiler, I installed the best boiler on the market. I never cut corners. I never spent money I did not have. Julian had taken the easy road. He had let his wife's obsession with looking rich on the internet destroy his integrity and his future. Right at that moment, my phone vibrated on the table. It was a text message. I looked at the screen. The message was from Chloe. It was a link to a crowdfunding website followed by a sickeningly sweet text. Hi, Wallace. We are planning a luxury family vacation to Dubai next month to create some amazing content for Leo's social media page. We are accepting sponsorships from family members. A generous donation would definitely earn you some major points, and maybe we could squeeze in a little weekend visit when we get back. Link is above. I stared at the screen for a long time. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. She was holding my grandson hostage and demanding ransom money to fund a fake influencer vacation. She was treating me like a fan she could milk for cash. She thought I was a foolish old man who would empty his meager retirement savings just for the privilege of seeing his own flesh and blood. She thought a donation would earn me points. She thought she held all the cards in this twisted little game she was playing. Vernon watched me from across the table. He saw the shift in my posture. "Is everything all right, Wallace?" he asked quietly. I placed the phone face down on the table. "Everything is perfectly fine, Vernon," I replied. "In fact, everything is becoming very clear." I did not reply to Chloe. I did not type out an angry response or demand to see my grandson. Silence is the most terrifying sound in the world to people who are used to getting their way. I let her sit with her phone waiting for a notification that would never come. She wanted to play games with money and family. She wanted to establish rules and exact payments. She had no idea that she was demanding spare change from the man who owned the very ground she was standing on. I turned my attention back to the financial documents. I asked Vernon to pull up the exact terms of the original investment contract we had Julian sign 3 years ago. I knew there were specific clauses regarding the misappropriation of company funds. If an executive was caught embezzling, the investors had the right to seize total control of the equity and terminate the executive immediately. Julian had signed those papers thinking they were just standard corporate formalities. He never imagined that the anonymous investors would actually audit him, and he certainly never imagined that the executioner coming for his fake empire would be his own father. He thought he was untouchable. I told Vernon to prepare the legal paperwork. I wanted every single loan documented. I wanted every unauthorized expense highlighted. I wanted the trap set so flawlessly that when it sprang shut, there would be no room for escape. They thought they were untouchable behind their gated community and their filtered photographs. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about reality. For 45 years, I fixed broken pipes and cleared out toxic waste. Now it was time to clean out the rot in my own family. I was going to let them enjoy their fake luxury for a few more days. I was going to let them dream about their trip to Dubai. And then I was going to tear their entire world down to the studs. Saturday afternoon arrived with a blistering sun that reflected off the manicured golf courses of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I pulled my 10-year-old pickup truck into a circular driveway filled with imported sports cars and luxury sedans. The valet, a young man in a crisp white uniform, hesitated for a fraction of a second when he saw my faded paint job. I handed him the keys with a polite nod and smoothed the lapels of my dark blue suit. It was not a designer label, but it was clean-pressed and bought with honest money. I walked through the grand glass doors of the clubhouse, feeling the immediate drop in temperature and the heavy gaze of old money. I was here for Leo. It was his second birthday party. I had not received an official invitation in the mail. Julian had sent me a brief text message the night before giving me the address and a strict arrival time. I knew Chloe had only allowed it because her parents were hosting and she wanted to maintain the illusion of a big happy family for her social media followers. I walked into the grand ballroom and stopped in my tracks. The room looked like a royal coronation, not a toddler birthday party. There were massive balloon arches, imported floral centerpieces, and a towering 5-tier cake decorated with edible gold leaf. A professional photographer was running around snapping pictures of Chloe posing with her wealthy friends. In the center of the room, a string quartet was playing classical music while waiters in tuxedos passed around miniature appetizers. It was a sickening display of excess for a child who would only remember the taste of the frosting. I spotted Julian standing near the bar. He looked incredibly tense. He was holding a glass of scotch and checking his phone every 5 seconds like a man waiting for a bomb to go off. I knew exactly why he was sweating. Vernon had confirmed that the startup was out of cash. Julian was standing in a room full of millionaires while secretly drowning in debt. Before I could even walk over to my son, I was intercepted. Richard and Susan, Chloe's parents, descended upon me like vultures spotting a wounded animal. Richard was a retired corporate lawyer with a fake tan and a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. Susan was dripping in diamonds and wore a dress that probably cost more than my first plumbing truck. "Wallace, what a surprise," Susan said, her voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "We honestly did not expect you to make it all the way out here. Did you get lost on the way past the service entrance?" She let out a high-pitched laugh that grated on my nerves. Richard chuckled and patted my shoulder with heavy, patronizing hands. "Now, Susan, be nice," Richard said, though his tone was equally mocking. "Wallace here worked hard his whole life fixing pipes and unclogging drains. He probably does not get to see the inside of places like this very often. It is good for him to see how the other half lives. Tell me, Wallace, how is the pension holding up with inflation these days? You must be pinching pennies just to keep the lights on in that little townhouse of yours." I looked at both of them. I did not flinch. I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. I remembered the financial documents sitting on my dining room table. I knew for a fact that Richard had recently lost a massive portion of his retirement portfolio in a bad real estate deal. He was funding this country club membership on credit, but they needed someone to look down on to feel superior, and my dark skin and blue-collar background made me the perfect target. I managed just fine. "Richard," I said quietly, "I have everything I need to be perfectly comfortable." Just then Chloe materialized beside her parents, holding Leo in her arms. Leo saw me and reached out his little hands. "Grandpa," he babbled, his face lighting up. My heart melted and I took a step forward to hold him. Chloe immediately pulled him back, holding him tightly against her chest. "Not right now, Wallace," she said sharply. "He is wearing a custom silk outfit for the photos, and I do not want him getting wrinkled. Besides, we are about to cut the cake soon, and we need him looking absolutely flawless for the main camera crew." She turned to her audience of wealthy friends who had gathered around to watch the interaction. She smiled her signature fake influencer smile. "Everyone, this is Julian's father, Wallace," she announced loudly, making sure her voice carried over the string quartet. "He used to be a plumber. We are so glad he could take the bus out here today. We know things are tight for him on his blue-collar pension. In fact, this party cost $15,000. Wallace could probably not even afford the gold leaf on the cake." A few of her friends snickered behind their champagne glasses. Richard and Susan beamed with pride at their daughter's cruel joke. Julian was standing just a few feet away. He heard every single word. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic, but he did not say a word. He just took another large gulp of his scotch and looked at the polished marble floor. Chloe looked at me, waiting for a reaction. She wanted me to be embarrassed. She wanted me to shrink away in shame and leave the party so she could tell everyone I was a bitter old man who did not fit in with their high-class lifestyle. Instead, I smiled. A genuine, relaxed smile that came from deep within. I looked at the towering 5-tier cake. I looked at the extravagant ice sculptures, the elegant string quartet, and the massive open bar serving premium liquor to a room full of arrogant strangers. Then I looked straight at Julian. He froze like a deer in headlights. I did not need to be embarrassed because I knew the absolute truth. I had seen the corporate credit card statements that morning on my desk. I knew exactly how this $15,000 party was being paid for. It was not paid for by Richard and Susan. It was not paid for by Chloe's influencer money. Julian had swiped the startup corporate card to cover the entire event. He was using my money to fund his wife's vanity project. My blind trust owned 60% of that company. Every single balloon, every single appetizer, every single drop of champagne in that room belonged to me. Chloe was bragging about a luxury lifestyle that I was secretly financing. She was mocking the very man who owned the floor she was standing on. I looked back at Chloe. Her smug smile faltered for a second, confused by my complete lack of humiliation. I picked up a silver fork and took a bite of the expensive cake, knowing their downfall was fast approaching now today. Monday morning arrived with a heavy rain that washed the streets of Atlanta clean. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, watching the water beat against the window pane. Promptly at 9 o'clock, my doorbell rang. It was Vernon, accompanied by Marcus, my lead corporate attorney. They did not look happy. They walked into my home, shaking off their wet umbrellas, and sat down at the table. Marcus placed a thick black binder in front of me. It was the official forensic audit of Julian and his tech startup. I opened the binder. The first few pages were a summary of the financial damage. I had known since last week that the company was bleeding money, but seeing the actual figures in stark black and white was a different kind of pain. The startup was not just failing due to market conditions or poor management. It was being actively pillaged. Julian was not making bad business choices. He was committing corporate fraud. Marcus explained the legal definition of what my son had done. Embezzlement. It is a cold and ugly word, especially when applied to your own flesh and blood. Julian had set up a complex series of shell vendor accounts. He was generating fake invoices for software development services that did not exist. The company was paying these fake invoices, and the money was routing directly back into Julian and Chloe personal bank accounts. It was a sophisticated scheme for a man who used to ask me for help with his middle school math homework. I turned the page, feeling the coarse paper under my thumb. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Vernon pointed to a specific ledger detailing the outbound wire transfers from the fake vendor accounts. I traced the numbers with my index finger. Every single stolen dollar was going toward funding Chloe and her fake rich mom influencer lifestyle. There were monthly payments of $2,000 for the lease on her Mercedes G-Wagon. The vehicle she paraded around the country club as a symbol of her husband and his massive success was quite literally stolen property. Then there were the shopping sprees. I saw tens of thousands of dollars spent at designer boutiques. Bags, shoes, and jewelry that she flaunted on her social media pages were all bought with embezzled corporate funds. But the most pathetic expense was the thousands of dollars spent on digital marketing firms that specialized in selling fake followers. Chloe was using stolen money to buy fake fans to pretend she was famous to people who did not care about her. It was an endless cycle of shallow vanity built on a foundation of felonies. Julian was risking federal prison time just to keep his wife draped in designer labels. Marcus cleared his throat and told me that as the majority shareholder of the blind trust, I had a fiduciary duty to act. If the authorities found out about the embezzlement before we reported it, my own assets could be frozen or seized in a federal investigation. My son had not only jeopardized his own freedom, but he had recklessly endangered the empire I spent 45 years building. He had put my legacy on the line for a woman who viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient peasant. I closed the binder. The anger I felt was cold and absolute. I thanked Marcus and Vernon for their work and told them to prepare the termination papers. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet house. I missed my grandson. Despite the disgust I felt for his parents, little Leo was innocent. He was just a boy who loved the wooden trains his grandfather carved. I picked up my phone to call Julian. I wanted to see Leo's face on the screen just for a minute to remind myself why I had to do this. I dialed the number for our usual Monday afternoon video call. The call rang once and went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. A few minutes later, a text message popped up on my screen from Chloe. The message was long and dripping with entitlement. She told me that she was officially blocking my video calls. She said that since I had refused to purchase the $1,000 imported stroller from her Amazon baby registry, I was clearly not invested in my grandson and his well-being. She wrote that a grandfather who truly cared would want his grandson riding in style, not looking like a charity case in public. She ended the message by saying I could try calling again next month if my financial situation improved and I decided to contribute to their lifestyle. I stared at the phone. She was using a child as leverage for a piece of overpriced fabric and metal. She was blocking a grandfather from seeing his grandson over a stroller. She had no idea that the phone she used to send that message, the internet connection she used to transmit it, and the house she was sitting in while typing it were all being paid for by my company. Her greed was a bottomless pit. If I had bought the stroller, she would have demanded a pony next. She was a parasite draining the life out of my son, and he was too weak to stop her. But I was not weak. I walked into my garage and looked at the woodworking tools hanging on the wall. The smell of sawdust always brought me comfort. I had spent my entire life fixing things that were broken. Sometimes you can patch a leaky pipe with a simple weld. Sometimes the rot is so deep you have to rip the whole plumbing system out and start from scratch. Julian was severely broken. Chloe was the toxic rot. I was going to rip the entire system out and I would not lose a single night of sleep over it. I sent an immediate email to Marcus authorizing him to formally freeze the startup corporate banking accounts by the end of the week. I knew that the moment the stolen money stopped flowing, the grand illusion would violently shatter. Julian would panic. Chloe would rage at the disruption of her perfect life. They would desperately come looking for a financial lifeline. They would eventually come crawling to the old man they deeply despised looking for salvation. And when they did, I would be fully ready. I walked back into the silent living room and picked up a silver-framed photograph of Loretta resting on the mantel. I ran my thumb slowly over the smooth glass. I whispered to her that I was truly sorry it had come to this point. I promised her I would protect the boy, but the man he had become needed to face the devastating consequences of his own greedy actions. The pieces were all securely in place on the board. The forensic audit was complete. The corporate theft was completely documented. The legal trap was perfectly set. Now all I had to do was quietly wait for my son to knock on my door. On Wednesday evening, the black Mercedes pulled up outside my modest townhouse. I sat by the window watching neighborhood kids ride their bicycles down the cracked sidewalk. The luxury vehicle purred in my working-class neighborhood. Through tinted glass, I saw the silhouettes of my son and his wife. Julian stepped out. He wore a navy suit that cost more than my grocery budget, but his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He leaned back into the car to say something to Chloe. She did not bother rolling down her window. She shook her head and went back to staring at her phone screen. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was refusing to set foot in my neighborhood. To her, this quiet street of hard-working families was a ghetto. She would let her husband beg his father for money but refused to scuff her designer shoes on my steps. Julian closed the door and walked slowly up my narrow walkway. I felt no pity. When the doorbell rang, I slowly stood up. I walked to the door and opened it to find my son forcing a terribly unnatural smile. "Hello, Dad," he said, slightly too loud. I stood blocking the doorway for a long moment looking at him. I waited for an apology. I waited for him to mention the laminated list of rules or the humiliating country club party. I waited for any sign of genuine remorse. Nothing came. "Come inside," I said, stepping aside. He walked into my living room looking entirely out of place among my worn furniture. He did not sit down. He paced across the rug like a trapped animal trying to escape a cage. "Dad, I know things have been tense lately." He started waving his hand dismissively. "Chloe and I have just been under a lot of pressure with the baby and the business, but I am actually here because I have a massive opportunity." I sat down in my favorite armchair and folded my hands in my lap. "An opportunity," I repeated. "Yes," he said, his eyes lighting up with a desperate, manic energy. "The startup is doing incredibly well, Dad. We are actually on the verge of a massive breakthrough. We just secured a major partnership, but we need a little bit of short-term liquid capital to finalize the expansion. It is what we in the tech industry call a bridge round." I listened to his corporate jargon with a completely blank expression. A bridge round. That was a very fancy term for begging your retired father to save you from federal fraud charges. I knew the truth. I had the forensic audit sitting in the top drawer of my desk. I knew his startup was dead. I knew he was broke. And I knew he was lying to my face without a single ounce of shame. "How much liquid capital are you looking for, Julian?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even. $50,000, he said quickly. "Just a $50,000 loan, Dad. I will pay you back in 3 months with 20% interest. It is a guaranteed return on your investment." I looked at him. $50,000. That was the exact amount he needed to cover the predatory loans he took against the company assets last week. He was trying to use my pension to cover his embezzlement tracks. It was a pathetic display of financial desperation and moral bankruptcy. "And what does Chloe think about this guaranteed investment?" I asked, motioning toward the front window where her luxury vehicle was still idling at the curb. "She is fully supportive, Dad," he lied smoothly. "She just had a slight headache, so she decided to stay in the car. She sends her love, though. Her love." The woman who handed me a printed menu of prices to see my grandson was sending her love from the leather seats of a stolen car. The sheer audacity of the lie was almost impressive. I let the silence stretch out between us for a very long time. Julian started to sweat. The silence was breaking his fake confidence. "Dad, please." He finally cracked his voice, dropping into genuine pleading. "I really need this money. If I do not get this bridge round, the expansion is going to collapse. You have always been careful with your savings. I know you have it. Please help me." I looked at my only son. I saw the fear in his eyes, but I also saw the greed. He was not asking for help to feed his family. He was asking for a lifeline to protect his lies. He wanted my life savings so his wife could keep pretending she was rich on the internet. I stood up and walked closer to him. I looked him dead in the eyes. "I will help you, Julian," I said quietly. The relief on his face was immediate and sickening. "Oh, thank God, Dad," he breathed out, wiping his forehead. "Thank you so much. I promise you will not regret this. You are saving the company." I held up my hand to stop his pathetic celebration. "There is a condition," I stated firmly. "I am not writing you a check today. I will give you an envelope with what you need on Friday morning. But you and Chloe must both come to pick it up." Julian frowned, slightly confused by the demand. "Why does Chloe need to be there?" he asked. "Because we are family," I replied, my voice cold and hard. "If I am making a $50,000 family investment, I want both of you present to understand what that means. You will meet me at the law offices of Marcus & Associates downtown at 10 on Friday morning. My lawyer handles all my large withdrawals. I will hand you the envelope there." Julian hesitated briefly, but his desperation overrode any suspicion. "Deal," he said eagerly, reaching out to shake my hand. I did not shake his hand. I just walked over to the front door and opened it. 10 on Friday morning, I repeated. "Do not be late." Julian nodded and hurried out the door, running down the walkway back to his waiting wife. I watched him climb into the passenger seat of the luxury vehicle. I saw Chloe lean over eagerly, asking him a question. I saw Julian smile and nod, giving her a thumbs up. They thought they had won. They thought they had manipulated the foolish old man into funding their fake lifestyle for another few months. I watched the sleek black Mercedes pull away from the curb and disappear down the street. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. My heart felt heavy, but my resolve was unbreakable. My son had lied to my face without a single ounce of hesitation. He proved he cared more about his public image than his own father. They wanted a $50,000 envelope. I was going to give them an envelope on Friday, but it would contain something far more permanent than money. It would contain their absolute ruin. Thursday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept through the streets of downtown Atlanta. I parked my old truck in the underground garage of the tallest glass skyscraper in the city, surrounded by luxury sedans that cost more than my first house. I rode the polished silver elevator up to the 50th floor, where the law firm of Marcus & Associates occupied the entire penthouse level. The receptionist, a young woman in a sharp suit, offered me imported sparkling water. I politely declined. I preferred to stand. I did not belong in this sterile world of marble floors, abstract artwork, and expensive cologne, but through sheer force of will, I owned a significant piece of it. Marcus was waiting for me in his massive corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. He had a team of 3 junior attorneys sitting around a massive mahogany conference table reviewing financial files. They all stood up respectfully when I walked into the room. I took a seat at the head of the table and placed my calloused hands flat on the polished wood, taking a deep breath. Today was the day we built the legal guillotine for my son. Marcus opened a thick leather folder and began distributing copies of the legal documents. As they reviewed the details, I turned my chair slightly to look out the floor-to-ceiling window. I could see the exact city block where I dug my first commercial plumbing trench in 1974. Looking down at the tiny cars, my mind drifted back to those early unforgiving days. Building my wealth was not a cinematic montage of easy victories. It was a brutal, agonizing war of attrition against a system designed to keep me at the bottom. I remembered walking into a major bank on Peachtree Street, asking for a small business loan to buy my first industrial pipe threader. The bank manager, a white man with a perfectly trimmed mustache, did not even look at my business plan. He looked at the color of my skin and the dirt under my fingernails, and laughed directly in my face. He told me that people like me did not run companies. He told me to go back to fixing residential toilets and be grateful for the work. I did not yell at him. I simply walked out and spent the next 3 years sleeping in the back of my unheated work van. I ate cold canned beans and saved every single dollar I earned until I could buy that machine in cash. Loretta and I sacrificed our youth to build an empire so our son would never know the humiliation of begging a bank for a chance. We gave Julian everything a child could ever desire. We gave him private tutors, summer camps, and Ivy League tuition. And what did he do with that privilege? He used it to steal from his own family just to impress a woman who thought I was a pathetic peasant. The memory of my struggle made the reality of his entitlement physically sickening. He had taken the legacy I built with blood, sweat, and broken bones and turned it into a cheap prop for his wife to parade around on the internet. Marcus cleared his throat, pulling my attention back to the present moment. He slid the master contract across the large table. This was the original investment agreement Julian had signed 3 years ago, when my blind trust provided the $2 million in seed capital. Marcus pointed to a specific paragraph on page 42 highlighted in yellow marker. It was the morals and fraud clause. I had insisted on including it despite Julian complaining back then that it was unnecessary legal jargon between family members. Now it was the exact mechanism of his absolute destruction. Marcus explained the mechanics of the legal trap to the room, ensuring every junior attorney understood the procedure. Because Julian had actively embezzled corporate funds for personal use, he was in material breach of the contract. The blind trust was legally authorized to instantly seize 100% of the equity without a vote or a grace period. Julian was no longer the majority owner. He was no longer the chief executive officer. He owned absolutely nothing. I nodded slowly as Marcus continued outlining the aggressive strategy. "We are voiding his salary effective immediately," Marcus said, tapping his gold pen against the paper to emphasize the point. "The corporate banking accounts have already been frozen as of 8 o'clock this morning. Any credit cards attached to the business will be permanently declined starting today. Furthermore, we are officially calling in the personal loans he took out against the company assets. The entire balance is due within 30 days. If he fails to pay, we have the right to seize his personal property to satisfy the massive debt." I looked at the printed documents. The trap was flawless. There were no hidden loopholes. There was no room for negotiation, arbitration, or emotional appeals. By the time Julian walked into this office tomorrow morning, he would be a man without a company, without an income, and facing unpayable debt. Marcus handed me a heavy black fountain pen. "All we need is your signature on these execution orders, Wallace," he said quietly, pushing the final pages toward me. "Once you sign these, the tech company belongs entirely to the trust, and Julian is officially terminated from the board of directors." I held the pen for a long moment, feeling the cool metal against my skin. A weak father might have hesitated at the precipice. A weak father might have thought about giving his son a second chance, or paying off his debts quietly to save the fragile family image. But I knew that saving Julian from the consequences of his actions would only guarantee his permanent moral failure. He needed to hit rock bottom hard. He needed to lose the fake, glamorous world he built, so he could finally understand the value of the real one. I pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name. I signed away his false empire with the hands that built his life. I pushed the documents back across the table to Marcus. "Make sure the paperwork is organized in a single plain envelope," I told him. "I want everything perfectly ready for tomorrow morning when he arrives expecting a check." Marcus nodded and gathered the files into a neat stack. I stood up and walked out of the corner office, leaving the lawyers to finalize the paperwork of his destruction. I rode the elevator back down to the dark underground garage and climbed into my old pickup truck. I drove back to my quiet neighborhood, feeling absolute peace settling over me. The trap was now fully set. The heavy legal blade was sharpened and raised high. I had spent 45 years protecting my son from the harsh realities of the unforgiving world. Starting tomorrow morning, I was going to let the world teach him the brutal lessons he refused to learn from me. All I had to do now was wait for Friday. Friday morning arrived with a bright, unforgiving sun that illuminated every corner of the city. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany conference table in the penthouse boardroom of Marcus & Associates. Marcus sat to my right, looking completely professional in his tailored gray suit with a stack of files neatly arranged in front of him. The room was absolutely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I wore my best dark suit, the one I bought for Loretta's funeral. It felt appropriate because today I was bearing my son fake empire. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy glass doors to the boardroom swung open. Julian walked in first, trying to project the confidence of a successful tech executive, but his tight smile betrayed his deep anxiety. Chloe followed closely behind him, and her presence immediately changed the energy in the room. She was dressed in a pristine white designer dress carrying a handbag that probably cost more than my first work truck. She looked around the luxurious penthouse office with a look of visible approval. She clearly assumed Julian had finally brought her to a place that matched her high-class standards. She did not even look at me when she walked in. She just pulled out a leather chair and sat down, crossing her legs and placing her expensive bag on the polished table. Julian sat down next to her, smoothing his silk tie. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice slightly too loud for the quiet room. "Thank you so much for agreeing to meet us here. Chloe and I are really excited about this bridge round. It is going to take the company to the next level." Chloe offered a stiff, condescending smile. "Yes, Wallace. We really appreciate you dipping into your little retirement fund to help out," she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "Julian promised me we will have your money paid back in a few months, so you will not have to worry about your pension running out." I looked at her perfectly manicured hands and her smug face. She was sitting in a room I was paying for, mocking the wealth she thought I did not have while waiting for a handout she thought she deserved. It was a spectacular display of human arrogance. I did not smile back. I did not exchange any pleasantries. I just looked at my son. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this, Julian?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Are you absolutely certain you need this $50,000 for a corporate expansion?" Julian swallowed hard, but nodded eagerly. "Absolutely, Dad," he lied without a single ounce of hesitation. "The company is poised for massive growth. We just need this quick injection of liquid capital to finalize the new software licensing deals. It is a guaranteed return on your investment." I stared at him for a long moment, letting the weight of his lie hang in the cold air of the boardroom. He had the chance to confess. He had the chance to come clean about the embezzlement, the fake vendors, and the massive debt. Instead, he doubled down on the fraud right to my face. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I placed it flat on the mahogany table, keeping my hand resting on top of it. "Inside this envelope is exactly what you deserve, Julian," I said quietly. "It contains the future of your company and the reality of your financial situation." I slid the thick envelope across the long table. It stopped exactly in front of Julian, but before he could even reach for it, Chloe snatched it up. Her eyes were wide with greedy anticipation. She practically ripped the flap open, expecting to find a certified cashier check for $50,000. She reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She frowned, looking at the top page. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp with sudden confusion. "Where is the check?" Julian leaned over to look at the papers in her hand. The color instantly drained from his face. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray. The top document was not a bank draft. It was the executive summary of the forensic audit prepared by Vernon. The bold black letters across the top read, "Evidence of corporate fraud and embezzlement." Below that was a detailed list of every single wire transfer, every fake vendor invoice, and every unauthorized personal expense he had made over the last 18 months. "What is this?" Julian Chloe demanded, dropping the papers onto the table as if they were on fire. "Why does it say fraud?" Julian could not speak. He was staring at the second document in the stack. It was the formal termination letter. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he read the legal text. He read the clause stating that he was in material breach of his contract. He read the notification that his salary was permanently voided and that he was immediately removed from the board of directors. But the most devastating part was the signature at the bottom of the termination letter. It was my signature. Below my name was my official title: majority shareholder and legal representative of the Coleman Blind Trust. Julian slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide with absolute horror. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the word. "You are the angel investor. You own the trust." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Yes, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I funded your company. I gave you $2 million to build a legacy. And you used my money to buy fake followers' designer handbags and a leased luxury vehicle. You stole from your own father to fund a shallow lie." Chloe was shaking her head frantically, picking up the papers and dropping them again. "No, this is a joke," she stammered, looking at Marcus. "This is some kind of sick joke. He is just a retired plumber. He does not have millions of dollars. Tell him, Julian. Tell him to stop playing games and give us the check." Marcus leaned forward and folded his hands. "I assure you, Mrs. Coleman, this is not a joke," he said in his smooth, professional voice. "Mr. Coleman is the sole owner of the holding company that controls the blind trust. As of this morning, your husband has been terminated for severe financial misconduct. The corporate accounts are frozen, the company credit cards are canceled. The personal loans your husband took out against the corporate assets are now due in full." Chloe gasped loudly. "But there is more," I said. "Look at the last document." Her hands were shaking as she pulled the final paper. It was an eviction notice. "What is this?" she shrieked. "We own our home." Julian wept quietly. "We do not own it, Chloe," he mumbled. "The company owns it." "Yes, indeed," I said, "and I am kicking you out today." The silence in the boardroom shattered. Chloe dropped the eviction notice onto the table as if it burned her. She stood up fast, her chair scraping loudly. "This is a complete lie," she screamed, pointing directly at my face. "You forged these documents. You are a retired plumber. You do not own a holding company, and you do not own our home." Julian sat frozen in his chair. His eyes were locked onto my signature at the bottom of the termination letter. His breathing became shallow and rapid. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of realization. "You were the angel investor. You funded the seed round 3 years ago. I did not move a single muscle." I looked into his terrified eyes and nodded slowly. "Yes, Julian," I answered coldly. "I took the money I earned from 45 years of breaking my back in the dirt and gave it to you. I hid behind a blind trust because your massive ego would never accept a handout from a working-class father. I wanted you to succeed on your own merits. But instead of building a legitimate business, you used my life savings to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth." Chloe slammed both hands down on the table, her face twisted in absolute fury. "Shut up," she hissed, her eyes wide and wild. "I do not believe a single word coming out of your mouth. Julian is a genius tech executive. He built this company. You are just a jealous old man trying to ruin our lives because I set boundaries for your grandson. You printed fake papers to scare us because you are angry about the $500 subscription fee. I am calling the police right now and having you arrested for fraud." She reached frantically into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. "Call them Chloe," I said calmly. "Please dial the police right now. But before you press the button, look closely at the math on page 4 of the forensic audit." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the bright screen. I did not wait for her to read it at all. I recited the numbers from memory, letting every single digit strike her like a blow. "Over the past 18 months, you and Julian have embezzled exactly $450,000 from my company," I stated, completely devoid of sympathy. "You funneled stolen capital through fake vendor accounts to pay for your personal luxury lifestyle. You owe my company $450,000 in stolen cash. Julian took out 2 predatory loans against the corporate assets totaling another $50,000. The total combined debt is $500,000. Chloe shook her head vigorously, refusing to process the information. "That is our company," she yelled. "We can spend the money however we want. It is not your company anymore," I corrected her sharply. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, my blind trust exercised its legal right to seize 100% of the equity due to gross financial misconduct. Julian is completely terminated. His salary is voided. You own nothing. And since the company is the actual legal owner of the suburban mansion you have been pretending to own, you are officially trespassing. You have 30 days to pack up your designer clothes and vacate my property." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic gasp. "You cannot evict us from our own home," she cried out, her face blotchy and red. "We have a baby. You cannot put your own grandson on the street." I looked at her with absolute disgust. "My grandson will be perfectly fine," I said. "He will learn to live in the real world instead of the fake one you constructed. And speaking of your fake world, there is one more detail you need to know. The lease on your Mercedes G-Wagon was registered under the corporate account. Since I froze those accounts and canceled the corporate credit cards this morning, the dealership was notified of the default. Your luxury vehicle was officially canceled today. It is currently scheduled for immediate repossession." Chloe completely lost her mind. The perfectly curated influencer mask she wore every single day violently shattered into a million jagged pieces. She let out a piercing scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward and slapped the stack of legal documents with all her might. The heavy white papers flew across the mahogany table, scattering onto the floor. "I will destroy you," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass windows. I will go on the internet and tell everyone what a monster you are. I will make sure you never see Leo again for the rest of your miserable life." I did not flinch. I did not even blink. Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, calmly stood up slowly from his chair. He smoothed the front of his gray suit and looked down at Chloe with the cold, detached professionalism of an executioner. "Mrs. Coleman, I highly recommend you lower your voice and take a seat," Marcus said firmly. "If you continue to threaten my client, I will have security remove you from this building. Furthermore, you need to understand the extreme gravity of your current legal situation. You are not the victim here. You are an active participant in a massive corporate fraud scheme." Chloe stopped screaming, glaring at the lawyer. Marcus pointed to the scattered papers. "My client has been generous, keeping this civil." Marcus continued. "The documents on the floor contain undeniable proof of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. If you do not comply with the eviction notice and repayment terms, Mr. Coleman authorized me to hand this file to the federal authorities today. We can make one quick phone call and the police will be at your house to arrest your husband before you even drive home. Since stolen funds were deposited into your joint accounts, you will be charged as a direct accessory to the crimes. You will both go to federal prison. Who do you think will take care of your son when you are locked in a cell?" The threat of prison hit the room like a physical shockwave. Chloe suddenly stopped breathing heavily. The arrogant fire in her eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by stark, blinding terror. She slowly lowered her hands and collapsed backward into her leather chair. She looked at Julian, expecting him to fight back, expecting him to have a secret plan to save them. But Julian was completely broken. He had his elbows on the table and his face buried in his hands. He was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking with the pathetic realization that his entire life was a massive lie. He had traded his dignity, his future, and his family for a woman who only loved his money, and now the money was completely gone. I watched them both completely dismantle themselves. There was no joy in my heart. There was only the cold, necessary satisfaction of restoring order. The $50,000 envelope they came to collect had successfully delivered their absolute ruin. I left the gleaming glass skyscraper and drove back to my quiet neighborhood. The sky was still a brilliant clear blue, but the storm had already made landfall in the life of my son. I walked into my kitchen and went through the familiar motions of brewing a pot of strong black coffee. The rich, bitter aroma filled the room, grounding me in reality. I poured myself a large mug and carried it over to the dining room table. I sat down in the same wooden chair where Vernon had exposed the absolute truth about Julian just a few days ago. I reached for my tablet and woke up the screen. I did not usually check social media, but today was quite special. I opened the application and navigated directly to the public profile of Chloe. I knew her ego would not allow her to stay silent after the absolute humiliation she suffered in the boardroom. She needed validation like a drowning person needs oxygen. She needed her fake followers to tell her she was successful to counteract the devastating reality that she was actually broke. There was already a glowing red ring around her profile picture indicating she was broadcasting a live video right at that very moment. I tapped the screen and leaned back, sipping my hot coffee. The video feed buffered for a second before the face of my daughter-in-law filled the screen. She was sitting on the front steps of the suburban mansion my company owned. She had spent the last hour reapplying makeup to hide the tears from her meltdown at the law office. She was wearing massive designer sunglasses and holding expensive iced coffee. She smiled into the camera, giving her audience that practiced empty gaze. "Hi, everyone," she chimed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I just wanted to hop on here and chat with you all for a few minutes. Julian and I have had such a crazy busy morning closing massive new tech deals for his company. We are just so blessed and so exhausted." I watched her lie with effortless precision. She told her viewers that they were planning to upgrade their luxury vehicles soon because the Mercedes was getting a little too basic for their evolving brand. She even reminded her followers to click the link in her biography to donate to their upcoming family vacation to Dubai, claiming it was going to be the most aesthetic trip they had ever taken. She was doubling down on the fantasy. She was trying to build a fortress of lies to protect herself from the crushing weight of the truth. But the truth does not care about your social media aesthetic. The truth is a relentless force of nature, and the truth was currently driving up her perfectly paved driveway in the form of two heavy-duty commercial tow trucks. I heard the deep, rumbling sound of the diesel engines through the tablet speakers before Chloe even noticed them. She was too busy reading glowing comments from her fake fans. Then the loud hydraulic hiss of the truck brakes echoed through her quiet, wealthy neighborhood. Chloe paused her monologue and turned her head, looking over her shoulder toward the driveway. Her perfectly rehearsed smile instantly vanished. The live video feed shook as she stood up fast. "Hey, what are you doing?" she yelled, her voice losing all its polished influencer charm. "You cannot park those ugly trucks here. This is private property." She started walking down the driveway carrying her phone so the camera captured the entire chaotic scene. Two large men wearing heavy work boots and high-visibility vests jumped out of the tow trucks. They did not care about her designer sunglasses or her live audience. They were carrying heavy metal chains and holding official repossession orders. One of the men walked directly to the back of the gleaming white Mercedes and knelt down to attach the towing hook. The other man headed straight for the sleek silver sports car of Julian parked right next to it. Chloe completely lost her mind. "Stop touching my car," she shrieked, dropping her iced coffee onto the pristine concrete. "I am calling the police. You are stealing my vehicle." The larger of the two men stood up and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He held it up for her to see. "We are not stealing anything, lady," he said in a loud, bored voice. "The corporate lease on this vehicle was officially canceled this morning by the holding company. The payments are in default. We have legal authorization to repossess both of these vehicles right now. If you want to call the cops, go ahead. They will just tell you to hand over the keys." Chloe froze. The reality of the boardroom meeting had finally breached the walls of her suburban fortress. She suddenly remembered she was holding her phone, and hundreds of people were watching this humiliating scene unfold live on the internet. Instead of turning off the camera, the sheer panic caused her to completely short-circuit. She spun around and sprinted toward the front door of the house, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Julian," she shrieked. "Julian, get out here right now." The front door swung open and Julian stepped out onto the porch. He had taken off his expensive suit jacket and his tie was hanging loose around his neck. He looked pale and thoroughly defeated. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Look!" Chloe screamed, pointing the camera directly at his terrified face. "They are taking my car, Julian. They are taking your car. Do something. Tell them you are a wealthy tech executive. Tell them you have the money." Julian just stood there staring at the tow trucks hauling his fake life away. "I do not have the money, Chloe," he finally admitted, his voice breaking loudly enough for the microphone to pick up every single pathetic syllable. "The company is gone. My father took everything. He terminated me. We are completely broke." Chloe let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. "You lied to me," she roared, her face twisted in pure hatred. "You told me you were a millionaire. You told me we were rich. You are nothing but a pathetic broke fraud. You ruined my life, Julian. You ruined my brand." She was not crying because her family was falling apart. She was crying because she was losing her luxury cars and her internet fame. She hurled a stream of vicious insults at her husband, completely forgetting the live audience watching their marriage violently fracture in real time. I watched my son shrink backward under her verbal assault, looking smaller and weaker than he had ever looked in his life. The tow trucks revved their massive engines and slowly pulled away, dragging the expensive symbols of their arrogant lifestyle down the street. I reached out and tapped the screen, closing the application. The silence returned to my dining room. I took a long, slow sip of my black coffee. The bitter taste felt incredibly satisfying. The purge had officially begun. The collapse of their fake luxury life did not end with the tow trucks driving away. Arrogant people do not learn humility when they lose their toys. They look for someone else to blame. I knew Chloe would not stay in that empty house. Less than an hour later, she packed 3 designer suitcases and fled to the sprawling gated estate of her wealthy parents, Richard and Susan. She ran back to the fortress of old money, hoping her father would use his high-powered lawyers to crush the retired plumber who dared to cut off her allowance. I sat in my quiet townhouse anticipating their next move. He was a retired corporate attorney who spent his career bullying people with less power. At 3:00, my telephone rang. I picked up the receiver but did not say hello. On the other end, I heard a man trying to control his fury. "Wallace," he barked, his voice laced with false authority. "This is Richard. My daughter arrived at my house in hysterics. She told me what you did. You are out of your mind if you think you can get away with this." I took a very slow breath. "I did exactly what was legally required, Richard," I replied, my voice flat. "I reclaimed stolen property and terminated a fraudulent executive." Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh. "You terminated nothing," he spat. "Chloe explained everything. You forged those papers. You illegally evicted them and canceled their vehicle leases. I have contacted my legal team. We are drafting a massive lawsuit against you right now. Richard wanted to bury me under legal jargon. We are suing you for emotional distress and illegal eviction, he proclaimed. My lawyers charge $800 an hour, Wallace. They will tie you up until your plumbing pension is drained. We will force you to sell that pathetic little townhouse just to pay your legal fees. Furthermore, we are filing for an immediate protective order to ensure you never get near my grandson again. You messed with the wrong family, Wallace. We are going to destroy you. He paused, waiting for me to beg for mercy. He expected the poor black plumber to be terrified by the threat of wealthy white lawyers. He thought intimidation tactics would force me to surrender. I let his threats hang in the air. Richard, I said quietly, are you sitting in your home office? Yes, he snapped. What does that have to do with anything? Turn on your secure fax machine, Richard, I instructed him. I am going to send you a document. I suggest you tell your lawyers to hold off on filing those lawsuits until you read it. Richard scoffed loudly. I am not reading anything you send me, Wallace. I am taking you to court. I rested my elbows on the kitchen table. Richard, you are a retired corporate attorney, I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. You understand the severe federal penalties for wire fraud. Turn on the machine right now. There was a brief silence. The certainty in my voice pierced through his arrogant bluster. I heard the clicking of buttons as he activated his office machine. I had Marcus prepare a sanitized copy of the forensic audit specifically for this moment. I placed the thick stack of papers into the automatic feeder of my home fax machine and dialed his private office number. The machine beeped as it began scanning the evidence. I stayed on the telephone line, listening to the silent tension on the other end. I heard the mechanical grinding of Richard's machine printing the documents in his luxurious estate. What is this garbage, he muttered. Just keep reading, Richard, I replied calmly. Read the exact destinations of the outbound wire transfers. The line was completely silent for almost 5 full minutes. I could hear his breathing change from angry and rapid to slow and shallow. He was a lawyer. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He recognized the undeniable paper trail of a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. He saw the staggering amounts of stolen capital. Most importantly, he saw exactly where that stolen capital had gone. The money went directly to the luxury car dealership. It went directly to the designer boutiques. It went directly to the digital marketing firms selling fake internet fame to his precious daughter, Wallace. He finally whispered, his voice completely stripped of its former arrogance. This is $500,000. Yes, Richard, I said. Your son-in-law stole $500,000 from my holding company to fund your daughter's fake luxury lifestyle. Because my blind trust owns the corporate entity, I have the authority to hand this file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation today. Richard tried to regain control. Julian is a fool, he stammered. My lawyers will draft a separation agreement. Chloe will divorce him. We will distance ourselves from his criminal activities. You can send him to prison, Wallace, but leave my daughter out of this. I smiled coldly. That is not how federal law works, Richard, I reminded him. You know that better than anyone. Chloe is not an innocent bystander. I leaned closer to the phone. The stolen corporate funds were deposited directly into their joint bank accounts, I explained clearly. Chloe used those specific accounts to pay off her credit cards and fund her extravagant shopping sprees. She spent the stolen capital. Under federal statute, she is an active accessory to grand larceny and wire fraud. If I make that phone call, Julian will not be going to prison alone. Your daughter will be standing right next to him in a matching orange jumpsuit. Your grandson will become a ward of the state until I file for full custody. The silence that followed was the sound of total defeat. The high-powered legal threats completely evaporated. The arrogant country club bravado vanished into thin air. Richard was trapped, and he knew it. He had tried to bring a civil lawsuit to a federal criminal fight. My lawyers are not going to sue me, Richard, I said, my voice echoing with finality. You are not going to file protective orders. You are going to sit your daughter down and explain the harsh reality of her situation. You are going to tell her she is entirely at my absolute mercy. If she ever tries to block my access to my grandson again, I will ruin her life. I understand. Wallace Richard mumbled, his voice barely audible over the phone. We will not be pursuing any legal action against you. Please do not contact the authorities. We will handle Chloe. I did not thank him. I did not offer any comfort. I just hung up the phone. The grandparents' war had ended before a single shot was officially fired in court. They thought they held all the power because they had a gated mansion and expensive suits. But true power does not need to shout. True power is having the absolute truth in your hands and being entirely willing to use it to burn the false empires of arrogant people to the ground. The sun had completely set by the time the doorbell rang at my townhouse. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of the heavy wooden door. I had spent the entire afternoon sitting in my quiet living room listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock. I did not rush to answer it. I let the chime fade into silence and waited. A few seconds later, there was a frantic knocking. It was not the confident knock of a wealthy tech executive. It was the desperate pounding of a man who had absolutely nowhere else to go. I stood up slowly and walked to the door. When I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open, the sight before me was pathetic. Julian was standing on my porch, shivering in the cool evening air. He did not have his leased luxury sports car. He must have taken a taxi or walked from the transit station. His expensive designer suit was completely wrinkled, and his tie was missing. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen from hours of crying. He looked like a frightened child who had just woken up from a terrible nightmare. But this was no nightmare. This was the reality he had built with his own 2 hands. "Dad, please let me in," he begged, his voice cracking. He looked over his shoulder as if he expected federal agents to be waiting in the shadows. I stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. He stumbled into the hallway, bringing the smell of cold sweat and sheer panic into my home. He did not walk into the living room to sit down. He simply collapsed right there in the narrow entryway. His knees hit the hardwood floor and he buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood over him, looking down at the top of his head. I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no desire to reach down and pull him up. A father's job is to prepare his son for the brutal realities of the world. I had shielded him from those realities for far too long. Now the world had arrived to collect its due. I lost everything, Dad. He wept, his voice muffled by his hands. Chloe left me. She took her suitcases and went to her parents' house. She said she is filing for divorce. She said I ruined her life. She took Leo with her and told me I am never going to see him again. The company is gone. The cars are gone. I have absolutely nothing left. He looked up at me, his face wet with tears. "You have to fix this, Dad. You have to give me the company back. I promise I will do better. I promise I will pay back every single cent I took. Just please do not let them put me in prison." I looked at him with absolute emotional detachment. "You cannot pay back $500,000, Julian," I said, my voice echoing off the narrow walls. "You have no assets. You have no equity. You have no leverage. You stole from the holding company to buy fake followers and expensive handbags for a woman who abandoned you the second the money dried up. You traded your integrity for a beautiful lie. Now the lie is over." Julian scrambled to his feet, leaning against the wall for support. He realized his tears were not working. He realized playing the victim was not softening my resolve. So he resorted to the oldest manipulation tactic in the book. He tried to use his own flesh and blood as a human shield. "What about Leo?" he yelled, his voice desperate and shrill. "What about your grandson? You cannot just kick us out onto the street. You are going to make your own grandson homeless. You cannot let Leo grow up in poverty. If you do not care about me, at least care about him. He is just a baby, Dad. You are destroying his future." I did not flinch. I did not even blink at his pathetic attempt at emotional blackmail. "Do not ever use that boy as a shield for your cowardice," I warned him, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Leo will never be homeless. Chloe's parents live in a gated mansion with 10 bedrooms. They will never let their precious daughter or her child sleep on the street. And even if they did, I have a legally binding trust fund established for Leo that will guarantee his education and his well-being. Leo is perfectly safe. Leo will be fully protected. You, however, are a completely different story." Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "But I am your son," he whimpered. "Yes, you are," I replied coldly. "And because you are my son, I am going to give you one single opportunity to stay out of a federal penitentiary." I walked into the living room and he followed me like a beaten dog. I picked up a single sheet of paper from the coffee table and handed it to him. He took it with trembling hands. "Read it," I commanded. Julian looked down at the paper. His eyes widened as he scanned the typed words. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling with confusion. "This is an employment contract. That is your salvation," I explained. "I own a massive commercial plumbing warehouse on the industrial side of the city. We supply pipes, valves, and heavy machinery to contractors across the entire state. Starting on Monday morning, you are going to put on a blue uniform and report to the warehouse manager. You are going to sweep the concrete floors. You are going to unload heavy pallets from delivery trucks. You are going to organize greasy inventory in a warehouse without air conditioning. You will work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Julian looked at me in absolute horror. He had never done a day of physical labor in his entire life. "Dad, I cannot do manual labor," he protested. "I am a tech executive. I have a degree in business management." "You are a thief," I corrected him sharply. "And you are going to work for $18 an hour. Every single paycheck you earn will be garnished by the holding company to pay back the money you stole. You will receive exactly enough money to rent a cheap apartment and buy basic groceries. The rest belongs to me. You will work at my warehouse until your entire debt is cleared. If you miss a single shift or complain to the manager, I will hand the forensic audit to the federal authorities, and you will spend the next 12 years in a prison cell." Julian stood in silence, staring at the paper. He realized his arrogant life was over. He slowly walked to the table, picked up a pen, and signed his name at the bottom, sealing his fate. I told him to arrive at 6 on Monday morning and close the door on him. It was time to rebuild his character from the ground up. Monday morning arrived with a brutal cold that seemed to sink directly into the bones. At exactly 5:45, the heavy metal doors of my commercial plumbing warehouse rolled open with a deafening mechanical screech. I stood on the steel catwalk above the main floor looking down at the loading bay. Down below, the delivery trucks were already lining up to receive their daily shipments of industrial steel pipes and heavy brass valves. The air smelled of motor oil, welding smoke, and raw, damp concrete. At exactly 6:00, I saw a figure walk through the employee entrance. It was Julian. He was not wearing a tailored Italian suit or imported leather shoes. He was wearing the standard-issue blue canvas uniform of my entry-level warehouse workers and a pair of steel-toed boots I had specifically ordered for him. He looked completely out of place among the hardened men who worked the early shift. He had taken the public bus to get here because his luxury sports car was currently sitting in a repossession lot. I watched him walk toward the shift manager with his shoulders slumped and his head hung low. The warehouse manager was a massive man named Hank who had worked for me for 25 years. Hank did not care about tech startups or venture capital. Hank cared about punctuality and hard work. I had explicitly instructed Hank not to treat Julian like the son of the owner. I told him to treat Julian exactly like any other unskilled laborer paying off a massive debt. I watched from the catwalk as Hank handed my son a heavy industrial push broom and pointed toward the massive loading dock. The dock was covered in thick, gray dust, discarded wooden splinters from heavy shipping pallets, and greasy metal shavings. Julian took the broom with trembling hands. For the first 2 hours, he struggled just to find a rhythm. His hands, unaccustomed to anything rougher than a computer keyboard, quickly developed bright red blisters. The warehouse was not air-conditioned. By 9:00, the morning sun heated the tin roof, turning the massive building into a suffocating oven. I watched Julian stop pushing the broom and lean heavily against a stack of crates, gasping for air and wiping thick sweat from his brow. He looked up at the catwalk and saw me standing there watching him in absolute silence. He expected me to show mercy. He expected me to call him up to my air-conditioned office and tell him that the punishment was over. I did not move. I just stared back at him with the cold, detached gaze of an employer expecting a job to be done. Julian swallowed hard, gripped the wooden handle of the broom, and went back to sweeping the filthy concrete floor. While Julian was experiencing the brutal physical reality of honest labor, Chloe was experiencing her own version of a nightmare. Over the weekend, her parents had forced her to leave their gated mansion. Richard kept his promise to me. He refused to pay her legal bills, and he refused to fund her influencer lifestyle. Chloe was forced to sign a lease for a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, overcrowded complex right next to the interstate highway. There were no marble countertops, no towering ceilings, and no manicured lawns. The walls were paper thin, and the sound of heavy traffic vibrated through the cheap single-pane windows every few seconds. She spent her entire Monday sitting on a cheap second-hand sofa, complaining bitterly to anyone who would listen. But her wealthy friends from the country club had entirely stopped answering her phone calls. They had seen the humiliating live video of the tow trucks taking away her luxury vehicles. In their shallow world, poverty was a contagious disease, and Chloe was officially infected. She refused to look for a job. She claimed that working at a normal retail store or an office would permanently destroy her elite personal brand. She expected Julian to magically fix the situation while she sat in the tiny apartment scrolling through social media feeling sorry for herself. When Julian finally walked through the door of that apartment at 7 o'clock that evening, he was completely physically destroyed. His blue uniform was stained with dark motor oil and dried sweat. His muscles ached with a deep, agonizing pain he had never felt in his entire life. He dropped his heavy steel-toed boots by the door and limped into the small kitchen, just wanting a glass of cold water. Chloe did not ask him how his first day was. She did not offer him a warm meal or a moment of comfort. She immediately started screaming at him. She pointed at the peeling paint on the ceiling and the cheap linoleum floor. "Look at this disgusting place, Julian," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the thin walls. "I cannot live like this. The neighbors are playing loud music and the water pressure in the shower is pathetic. You need to call your father right now and apologize. Tell him you will do whatever he wants so we can go back to our real house. You need to fix this right now because I am losing my mind." Julian stood in the cramped kitchen holding a plastic cup of tap water. He looked at his wife, really looked at her. For the first time in his life, the thick fog of his own arrogance completely lifted. He saw her not as the beautiful, glamorous woman he wanted to show off to the world, but as the selfish, parasitic anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. He looked down at his own hands. They were covered in dirt and fresh, bleeding blisters from the heavy broom. He remembered sweeping the exact same massive concrete floors his father had walked on for 45 years. The pain in his back and the exhaustion in his bones suddenly brought everything into razor-sharp focus. His father had endured this exact agonizing physical labor every single day for decades just to put food on their table. His father had swallowed his pride, endured racist insults, and broken his own body to build a financial empire so Julian would never have to suffer. And Julian had taken that incredible sacred sacrifice and thrown it directly into the garbage just to buy fake followers for the screaming, ungrateful woman standing in front of him. "I am not calling him Julian," said his voice barely above a raspy whisper. Chloe stopped yelling and stared at him in pure shock. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her face turning bright red with fresh anger. "I said I am not calling him Julian," repeated his voice, growing slightly stronger and much colder. "We are not going back to that house, Chloe. That was never our house. It belonged to my father. The cars belonged to my father. You only loved the money, and now the money is entirely gone forever." Chloe just wept loudly as the harsh, cold reality finally set in perfectly for both of them. The reality of the warehouse job settled over Julian like a heavy lead blanket. He came home every single night covered in sweat and industrial grease. Chloe watched him walk through the door of their cramped apartment and finally understood that the money was permanently gone. There was no secret bank account waiting to rescue her. There was no bridge round of venture capital. There was only a broken man making $18 an hour to pay off a massive corporate debt. Her fantasy of a luxury lifestyle was completely dead, and she decided to burn the entire marriage down. By the end of the second week, she packed her bags while Julian was at work. She did not leave a note. She simply took Leo and walked out the door. The very next morning, a man in a cheap suit showed up at my commercial warehouse. He walked right past the loading dock and handed Julian a thick stack of legal papers. Chloe had officially filed for divorce. Julian called me from the warehouse floor, sounding completely devastated. He told me she was demanding full legal custody of my grandson, along with massive alimony and monthly child support payments. She wanted thousands of dollars a month to maintain the standard of living she felt she was owed. She knew Julian was broke, but she was incredibly vindictive. She wanted to squeeze blood from a solid stone. I told Julian to bring the legal papers to my house immediately after his shift ended. When I read the divorce petition, my blood ran cold. Chloe was not just asking for money. She was actively trying to destroy Julian in the eyes of the law. She painted him as a violent, abusive fraud who lied to her about his corporate wealth constantly. She claimed she lived in constant fear for her safety and the safety of her child. She told the court that Julian had intentionally manipulated her into signing financial documents she did not understand. She was playing the role of the innocent, helpless victim perfectly. She wanted the judge to believe that she was a devoted mother trapped in a nightmare with a dangerous man. She completely omitted the fact that she had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen money on designer clothes and fake internet followers. She wanted to erase her massive guilt entirely from the record. Julian sat in my living room with his head buried in his hands. He was physically exhausted from the warehouse and emotionally shattered by the betrayal. "She is taking my son, Dad," he wept. "She is going to convince the judge that I am a monster and I will never see Leo again." I looked at my son and saw genuine fear in his eyes. He had finally realized that the woman he married never loved him at all. She only loved the things he could buy for her. I told him to sit up straight and stop crying now. I told him that family court is a battlefield and tears do not win wars. Evidence wins wars. I assured him that we were going to fight her with every single legal weapon we had. But Chloe was not finished with her manipulative schemes. She knew that Julian was weak, but she also knew that I was the real threat. She knew I had the money and the lawyers to expose her lies, so she decided to attack me directly. 2 days later, a sheriff deputy knocked on my front door holding a formal legal notice in his right hand. I opened the door and accepted the paperwork without a single word. It was an emergency restraining order. Chloe had gone to a judge and sworn under oath that I was a violent, threatening individual. She claimed that I had aggressively confronted her at the country club and stalked her outside her new apartment. She wrote that my behavior was erratic and dangerous. The order legally banned me from coming within 500 feet of her or my grandson Leo. She was trying to permanently sever my relationship with my own blood using fabricated lies and weaponized legal maneuvers today. She thought the restraining order would intimidate me. She thought I would back down to avoid a public scandal. Wealthy people often fear public embarrassment more than they fear losing money. But I am not a country club aristocrat. I am a man who spent 45 years digging trenches in the mud. I do not scare easily, and I absolutely do not run from a fight. I read the restraining order twice, and then I placed it neatly on my kitchen table. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, immediately afterwards. Marcus answered on the first ring. I told him about the divorce petition and the emergency restraining order. I could hear the cold professional anger in his voice. He told me that family court judges do not look kindly on people who use protective orders as strategic weapons in divorce cases. We scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. I spent the rest of the evening gathering every single piece of evidence I had collected over the past few months. I found the laminated list of grandparent rules she had handed me on her pristine front porch steps previously. I printed out the text messages where she demanded a $500 monthly subscription fee just to see my grandson. I printed the messages where she tried to extort me for a luxury vacation to Dubai. I gathered the financial records proving she had actively participated in the massive corporate embezzlement scheme. I had an ironclad paper trail documenting her incredible greed and manipulation. Chloe was walking into family court armed with fake tears and fabricated stories. I was walking into family court armed with undeniable facts and the absolute truth. I felt a deep, cold determination growing inside. She had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She assumed that because she was a beautiful blonde woman crying in a courtroom, the judge would automatically hand her a victory. She forgot that she was dealing with a man who had built an empire by anticipating every single move of his opponents. I had forced Julian to sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement before they got married. It was a condition of my original investment in his tech company. Chloe had signed that document years ago, completely blinded by her endless greed. She had signed away any right to my family assets forever. The trap was fully set, and she was eagerly marching right into it. She wanted to paint Julian as a broke fraud and me as a violent monster. She wanted to play the victim and walk away with full custody and massive financial support. She had no idea that her entire strategy was about to violently collapse. I looked at the photograph of my late wife Loretta on the mantle. I promised her again that I would protect our grandson from that toxic woman. Tomorrow we were going to family court. Tomorrow I would end her fake victim routine completely. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Family Courthouse swung open with a dull thud echoing through the long marble hallway. I walked into the courtroom wearing my dark charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight despite the dull ache in my lower back. Marcus walked right beside me carrying a thick leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of my daughter-in-law. Julian was already sitting at the respondent table looking incredibly small and utterly defeated. He wore the only cheap suit he had left after the repossession, and his hands were trembling as he stared down at the scratched wooden table. Across the aisle sat Chloe looking like a picture of absolute innocence. She wore a modest, high-necked floral dress with her blonde hair pulled back neatly into a simple clasp. She had completely dropped the wealthy influencer aesthetic for this very specific occasion. Today she was playing the role of the terrified, helpless victim, and she had clearly practiced her performance. Her high-priced divorce attorney sat beside her, radiating a smug confidence. They thought this was going to be an easy slaughter. They thought they were dealing with a frightened, broken family with deep pockets and no backbone. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them inside that briefcase. The honorable judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes, called the hearing to order. Chloe was called to the witness stand almost immediately. The moment she sat down in the wooden chair, she activated the tears. It was a masterful display of calculated emotional manipulation. She wept quietly as her attorney guided her through a completely fabricated narrative of emotional abuse and financial control. She told the judge that Julian was a volatile tyrant who hid his massive tech fortune from her. She claimed he intentionally forced them into a tiny, dangerous apartment just to torture her mentally. Then she turned her sights onto me. She pointed her finger in my direction and let out a dramatic sob. She swore under oath that I was an aggressive, controlling patriarch who used my wealth to terrorize her and my grandson. She told the judge I had stalked her and threatened her life. She begged the court to grant her full custody of Leo along with $10,000 a month in alimony to keep them safe. The judge listened intently, taking careful notes. Julian kept his head down, too ashamed to even look up. Chloe looked over at me with a microscopic smirk hidden beneath her tears. When her attorney finally finished painting us as monsters, the judge turned her attention to our side of the room. Marcus stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with complete professional calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not object angrily. He simply approached the center of the courtroom and asked the judge for permission to submit our first exhibit into the official legal record. The judge nodded. Marcus pulled a laminated piece of paper from his leather briefcase and handed it to the bailiff. The bailiff passed it to the judge. I watched the eyes of the judge scan the printed document. It was the exact copy of the grandparent rules that Chloe had handed me on her front porch. Marcus asked Chloe to identify the document. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, claiming it was just a normal list of boundaries for the child. Marcus smiled a cold, lethal smile. He asked her to read the section regarding the $500 monthly subscription fee for weekend access. The courtroom fell completely silent. Chloe stammered, trying to explain that it was just a joke or a misunderstanding. But Marcus was already holding up our second piece of evidence. Marcus submitted a certified printed transcript of every single text message Chloe had sent me over the past year. He read her words out loud for the entire courtroom to hear. He read the message where she demanded I purchase a $1,000 stroller just to video call my grandson. He read the message where she linked a crowdfunding website saying a massive donation for her Dubai vacation would earn me points to visit the baby. The judge stopped taking notes and stared directly at Chloe. The look of sympathy on the face of the judge instantly morphed into pure disgust. Marcus systematically dismantled her entire victim narrative in less than 10 minutes. He proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Chloe was not a terrified mother trying to protect her child. She was an opportunistic extortionist who used her own son as a financial bargaining chip. Her expensive attorney tried to object, claiming the messages were taken out of context, but the judge immediately overruled him. The printed words were undeniable. Chloe began to panic, her fake tears drying up as genuine terror took over. Her attorney desperately tried to pivot the argument back to the money. He loudly declared that regardless of the text messages, his client was legally entitled to half of the marital estate and substantial alimony based on the corporate assets. He demanded that the court force Julian and me to open our bank accounts to support the lifestyle Chloe had grown accustomed to. Marcus simply walked back to his table and pulled out the final document. It was a thick stack of stapled papers with a blue legal backing. Marcus submitted it to the judge and handed a copy to the opposing counsel. It was the prenuptial agreement. When I secretly funded Julian Tech's startup, I forced him to make Chloe sign that specific document. I knew her true nature long before Julian ever did. The agreement was ironclad, bulletproof, and legally absolute. It explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce, Chloe was entitled to absolutely nothing from the family businesses, the trusts, or the holding companies. Furthermore, it stated that she waived all rights to any spousal support if the marriage dissolved. Her attorney scanned the pages, his face turning as pale as a ghost. He whispered frantically to Chloe, who looked sick right there on the witness stand. Marcus stood tall and addressed the judge one final time. He explained that Julian was currently employed as a manual laborer at my plumbing warehouse, earning exactly $18 an hour. He explained that Julian had zero corporate equity, zero savings, and zero hidden wealth. There was absolutely no marital estate to divide. There was no secret fortune to raid. Chloe had signed away her rights to the family money years ago, and the man she was trying to bleed dry was legally penniless. The courtroom massacre was entirely complete. Chloe realized in that exact moment that she was not walking away with a massive monthly paycheck. She was walking away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and massive legal bills today. She had tried to dig a grave for my son and me, but she had thrown herself directly into the bottom of it. I sat in my wooden chair looking at her perfectly pale face, feeling the absolute justice of the moment wash over me completely. The courtroom remained entirely silent as the judge finished reading the prenuptial agreement and the printed text messages. She slowly took off her reading glasses and placed them flat on her heavy wooden desk. She looked directly at Chloe. The look in her eyes was cold and completely devoid of any sympathy. "You came into my courtroom today seeking protection and financial support," the judge began, her voice echoing loudly across the large room. "You swore under oath that you were a victim of abuse and financial control. You painted a picture of a terrified mother running for her life. But the undeniable evidence presented today tells a completely different story." The judge picked up the laminated piece of paper containing the list of grandparent rules. She held it up for the entire room to see clearly. "You attempted to extort your own father-in-law for access to his biological grandson. You demanded $500 a month for a subscription fee. You demanded a luxury vacation to Dubai. When he refused to fund your lavish lifestyle, you attempted to weaponize this legal system to destroy him. You filed a fabricated restraining order based on absolute and total lies. I find your behavior completely reprehensible," the judge stated firmly. "You have wasted the valuable time of this court, and you have attempted to manipulate the law for your own selfish financial gain. Therefore, I am immediately dismissing the emergency protective order against Mr. Coleman. It is entirely without merit. Furthermore, I am granting Mr. Coleman legally protected visitation rights with his grandson. You will never again have the power to keep that boy away from his grandfather." Chloe sank lower into her wooden chair. Her face was completely pale, and her hands were shaking violently in her lap today. The judge then turned her attention to the financial demands outlined in the divorce petition. "You have requested $10,000 a month in spousal support and full access to the marital estate," she continued. "However, the prenuptial agreement you willingly signed is legally sound and fully enforceable. You waived all rights to alimony. You waived all rights to the family business and the blind trust. Because your husband was terminated from his corporate position for severe financial misconduct, there is absolutely no marital wealth to divide. You are entitled to exactly nothing from the Coleman family assets at all." Chloe let out a loud gasp. "But I have no money," she blurted out, interrupting the judge. "I have no job and I have no place to live. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing." The judge banged her wooden gavel sharply, demanding immediate silence. "You are an able-bodied adult who has completely refused to seek employment." The judge rebuked her. "You chose to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen corporate funds on designer handbags and fake internet followers instead of securing your financial future. Your lack of income is entirely a result of your own choices." "Which brings us to the most critical issue of child custody," the judge announced. "A child requires a stable and honest environment to thrive. You currently have no income, no permanent residence, and a proven history of using your child as a financial bargaining chip." The judge looked over at Julian. "Mr. Coleman, you are currently employed full-time at a commercial plumbing warehouse. You earn a steady legal wage of $18 an hour. You have secured a modest apartment. You have taken full responsibility for your massive financial debts by working honest manual labor every single working day. While your past corporate actions were highly illegal and deeply shameful, your current efforts to provide a stable life for your son are commendable," the judge said. "Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that Julian Coleman is awarded primary physical and legal custody of the minor child Leo." Chloe let out a piercing scream. "No!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "You cannot take my baby away from me. You cannot give him to a warehouse worker. I am a social media influencer. I need my son for my brand." The judge slammed her gavel down very forcefully. "Sit down immediately, or I will have the bailiff remove you from this courtroom," the judge ordered, her voice booming with absolute authority. Chloe collapsed back into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "You will be granted limited supervised visitation every other weekend," the judge continued, addressing Chloe. "You will also be required to pay standard child support to your husband once you secure steady legal employment." "The hearing is officially adjourned." The judge stood up and walked out of the courtroom, leaving absolute silence in her wake. The massacre was over. The absolute destruction of Chloe and her fake life was finally complete. Her expensive divorce attorney quickly gathered his legal files and shoved them into his leather briefcase. Chloe grabbed his arm, looking desperate. "We have to appeal this," she cried. "You have to fix this right now." The attorney pulled his arm away and looked at her with pure professional disdain. "There is no appeal," he told her coldly. "You lied to me about the money and you lied to me about the prenuptial agreement. My services are officially terminated. Oh, and I expect my massive legal bill to be paid in full by the end of this month, but my parents said they are not paying for my lawyer anymore." Chloe panicked. "How am I supposed to pay you without my alimony?" The attorney simply shrugged his shoulders, walked through the heavy wooden gates, and left her completely alone. She had nothing left. She had no luxury vehicle to drive home. She had no massive suburban mansion waiting for her. She had no wealthy husband to manipulate and steal from. She did not even have custody of her own son. All she had was her expensive smartphone and thousands of fake internet followers who cared absolutely nothing about her reality. I stood up slowly from my wooden chair and buttoned my suit jacket. Julian walked over to me. His eyes were red, but for the first time in years he looked like a real man. He looked like a father who finally understood the true value of hard work and honesty. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his voice filled with genuine heavy gratitude. "I know I do not deserve your help, but thank you for saving Leo from her." I looked at my son and nodded my head slowly. "You have a long, brutal road ahead of you, Julian," I said. "You are going to sweep that warehouse floor every single day until your debt is paid. But at least you will be sweeping it as a free man with your son safe at home." We walked out of the courtroom together, leaving Chloe sitting completely alone at the table, crying into her empty hands. She wanted to play games with my family. She wanted to put a price tag on my grandson. She learned the hardest lesson of all. True power always wins, and the absolute truth will always destroy a house built on arrogant lies today. 6 months passed since the heavy gavel fell in that Fulton County courtroom. The thick dust of destruction finally settled, leaving behind a completely new reality for everyone involved. I kept a close eye on the situation from a safe distance. Chloe experienced a devastating freefall from her artificial elite status. Her wealthy parents kept their absolute word and completely cut off her financial supply. They refused to pay for her luxury apartment, and they certainly refused to fund her fake social media brand. Without stolen corporate money to buy fake followers, her internet presence rapidly withered and completely died. The luxury brands stopped sending her free promotional items. The country club friends stopped returning her desperate text messages. She was forced to face the brutal reality of the working-class world she used to mock so relentlessly. I drove past a cheap strip mall on the outskirts of the city last Tuesday and saw her through the plate glass window. She is currently working as a front desk receptionist at a discount tanning salon. She wears a cheap polyester uniform instead of imported designer dresses. She spends her long days wiping down sweaty tanning beds and handing out fresh towels to strangers for minimum wage. There are no more private jets and absolutely no more imported champagne. She tried to maintain her arrogant attitude at first, but minimum wage retail jobs have a very specific way of breaking a false ego. She is now just another ordinary person struggling to pay her utility bills on time every single month. She only sees my grandson every other weekend, and when she does, she has to pick him up in a used compact car she bought on a high-interest payment plan. The absolute poetic justice of her situation is incredibly satisfying to witness today. Julian, on the other hand, took a very different path entirely. I honestly expected him to quit the warehouse job after the first grueling month. I fully expected him to break under the immense physical strain and come begging for a comfortable office position. But the courtroom massacre and the complete loss of his artificial world changed something deep inside his core. He kept showing up at the loading dock at exactly 5:45 every single morning without fail. He swept the concrete floors until they were spotless. He unloaded heavy steel pipes until his soft hands were covered in thick, permanent calluses. The warehouse manager, Hank, gave me weekly reports on his steady progress. Hank told me that Julian stopped complaining after the second week of hard labor. He stopped mentioning his useless business degree and his former fraudulent tech company. He started eating his lunch on the wooden pallets right alongside the other blue-collar workers. He listened to their stories, and he finally learned how to speak to men who worked with their hands. The physical labor stripped away the toxic layers of his extreme entitlement. He was exhausted every single night, but it was a clean, honest exhaustion. He took his meager $18 an hour paycheck and paid his rent on time. Every single remaining dollar went directly to the holding company to slowly pay off the massive mountain of debt he created. He was no longer a fraudulent executive pretending to be a billionaire on the internet. He was a working man earning his keep, one painful blister at a time. I watched him from the steel catwalk occasionally, and for the first time in many long years, I did not feel a profound sense of disappointment when I looked down at my only son. On a quiet Saturday morning, the doorbell rang at my townhouse. I walked to the front door and opened it slowly. Julian was standing on my porch, holding little Leo in his strong arms. It was a perfect mirror image of the terrible encounter on that pristine suburban porch 6 months ago, but the context was entirely, completely different this time. Julian was wearing a faded cotton work shirt and a pair of worn denim jeans. He looked extremely tired, but his eyes were clear and completely steady. He did not have a laminated list of rules hidden in his pocket. He did not have a manipulative script prepared by a greedy wife. He just offered a genuine, humble smile to me. "Good morning, Dad," he said quietly. "We brought you something special today." He set Leo down on his feet, and the little boy ran straight into my living room carrying a small paper bag. Leo reached inside and pulled out the wooden train set I had carved for him all those months ago. He sat down on my living room rug and immediately started connecting the wooden train cars together, making happy little train noises. Julian walked into the house and stood respectfully in the narrow entryway. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for a business loan or a special favor. He just wanted to bring his son to spend quality time with his grandfather. I walked over to the kitchen and poured 2 warm cups of black coffee. I handed one directly to my son. We stood there together in the quiet house watching Leo play happily with the handmade toy that Chloe had once treated like absolute garbage. It was a beautiful moment of complete family restoration for us both. We drank our warm coffee in comfortable silence for several minutes. Julian watched his son play, and then he turned his head to look directly at me. "Dad, I have been sweeping the warehouse floors for 6 months now," he said, his voice steady and incredibly respectful. "I know every single plumbing part number in the massive inventory. I know the delivery routes and I know the complex loading schedules. But I want to do much more than just sweep the concrete floors. I want to truly learn the actual business." I looked at him very carefully. "What exactly are you asking me, Julian?" I inquired calmly. He set his coffee mug down on the table and stood up straight. "I am asking you to teach me how to be a real plumber," he stated firmly. "I want to learn how to accurately cut pipes and weld heavy joints. I want to learn how to read the complex blueprints and secure the profitable municipal contracts. I want to learn the honest trade that put food on my table when I was a growing child. I do not want to be a tech executive ever again in my life. I want to build something real with my own 2 hands just like you did." I stared at him, letting his serious words hang in the silent room. He was asking for the hardest path possible. Commercial plumbing is a brutal, unforgiving trade that destroys your knees and breaks your back over time. But it is an honest trade. It is a trade built on solid integrity and tangible results. I looked at his calloused hands and the new quiet strength in his posture. I nodded slowly. "Be at the main downtown job site at 4. The new order began. The late afternoon sun filtered through the small, dusty window of my garage, casting long, golden shadows across the concrete floor. The air was thick with the warm, comforting smell of fresh sawdust and old motor oil. I stood at my heavy wooden workbench holding a piece of raw, unfinished pine in my calloused hands. Standing right next to me on a sturdy wooden stool was my grandson, Leo. He was 3 years old now, and his wide, bright eyes watched my every single movement with absolute fascination. I gently guided his small, soft hands over the smooth surface of the wood, teaching him how to hold the sanding block correctly. We were building a new wooden train together. It was not a plastic toy bought from a luxury boutique, and it certainly had no brand name attached to it. It was just a simple, honest piece of craftsmanship. I watched him press the sandpaper against the wood, his little face scrunched up in serious concentration. He was learning that creating something beautiful requires patience, effort, and a willingness to get your hands dirty. I looked at his happy face and felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle into my bones. 6 months ago, his mother tried to put a price tag on his childhood. She wanted to charge me a $500 monthly subscription fee just to be his grandfather. Now she was completely gone from his daily life, living in a cramped apartment and wiping down tanning beds for minimum wage. She only saw him every other weekend, and during those brief visits, She had absolutely no power to manipulate his reality. Leo was growing up in a world of absolute truth. He did not know about designer clothes or luxury vehicles. He knew about the smell of sawdust, the warmth of a simple home-cooked meal, and the quiet, steady love of a grandfather who would burn the entire world down to protect him. Just outside the garage, I heard the familiar rumble of my old pickup truck pulling into the driveway. A moment later, Julian walked through the side door. He was wearing his heavy canvas work jacket covered in dust and grease from a long day at the commercial plumbing job site. He did not look like the arrogant tech executive who tried to lie to me in a luxury boardroom. He looked like a real man. His shoulders were broad, his jaw was set, and his hands were thick with fresh calluses. I watched them together and felt a heavy emotional weight finally lift from my old, tired shoulders. We worked side by side in the quiet garage, the rhythmic sound of sanding filling the warm space. I looked at Julian and remembered the scared little boy he used to be when Loretta was alive. Loretta had possessed a gentle, loving spirit. She believed that love could conquer any flaw. If she were alive, she might have begged me to show Julian mercy when the forensic audit revealed his massive embezzlement. She might have asked me to pay off his debts quietly. But Loretta never had to face a predator like Chloe. As much as I missed my beautiful wife, I knew that her gentle approach would have completely destroyed our son. Sometimes love cannot be soft. Sometimes love must be a heavy iron anvil that shatters a weak foundation, so a stronger one can be forged in the blazing fire. By giving him everything, I had turned him into a weak, fragile sheep surrounded by ravenous wolves. I had funded his extreme arrogance and allowed a parasitic woman to drain his soul completely empty. When I orchestrated that legal guillotine in the boardroom, I knew people would call me a monster for evicting my own son. But a true father only cares about the survival of his bloodline. I had to become the wolf to save my family. I had to bare my teeth and tear down his fraudulent empire so he could learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. I performed a brutal, necessary surgery to completely purge a deadly infection. Julian looked at me and gave me a quiet nod of deep, genuine respect. It was a look of absolute understanding between 2 men who knew the exact price of integrity. He set Leo back down on the wooden stool and grabbed a piece of sandpaper. He was earning his $18 an hour with incredible honor. More importantly, he was slowly paying back the $500,000 he had stolen. It would take him many long years to clear that debt, but he was building the equity of a strong, unbreakable character. He was finally becoming the man I always hoped he would be. I turned my attention back to Leo. He was stacking wooden blocks, perfectly content in our dusty garage. He did not need an expensive birthday party. He just needed his father and his grandfather showing him how to shape the world with his own hands. The generational curse of entitlement was broken. The weed of arrogance had been ripped out by the roots. But my heart was at peace. I had protected the legacy I built with my blood and sweat. Julian brushed the sawdust off his thick canvas jacket and placed the finished wooden train on the workbench. "We did a good job today, Dad," he said. We cleaned up the tools and walked back into the house together, holding Leo by his small hands. The house was warm and smelled like roasting meat and fresh vegetables. There were no expensive catered meals and no crystal champagne flutes. There was just the honest, simple reality of a family that had survived a massive, devastating storm. I sat down in my favorite leather armchair and watched my son play on the floor with my grandson. The absolute ruin I brought upon them was the greatest gift I could have ever given. I had stripped away the heavy, suffocating illusion of wealth and handed them the absolute freedom of the truth. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, feeling the presence of Loretta smiling down on us from somewhere far above. The wolf had successfully protected the pack. The long, exhausting war was finally over. I smiled quietly to myself, feeling truly grateful today. Respect is never purchased, it is forged. For decades, I silently built an empire believing my sacrifice would buy my son's character. I was wrong. By handing them everything, I only funded their arrogance. When my daughter-in-law tried to put a price tag on my own flesh and blood, she forgot one crucial rule. The man who signs the checks holds the power to burn the bank down. I didn't destroy my family out of vengeance. I demolished a house of lies to build a foundation of truth. Sometimes absolute ruin is the only path to real redemption. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to my channel. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. Thank you so much for listening until the very end today.